Good evening, viewers. Welcome to another episode of the Speakers Gallery. Our guest today is not somebody who's new to this program. It's somebody who is very well known in this. He is Andrew Franklin, an ex-Marine major who is a security expert and an analyst also. Welcome, Andrew Franklin.
Thank you for having me.
Andrew, you're a former Marine major.
Right.
The Al-Shabaab attack on the Manda Bay base, which also houses it's a Kenyan Navy base that houses American security personnel there.
At Camp Simba, yes.
Yes, at the camp.
At Camp Simba.
Yes. That was least expected, and it literally sent shivers through the spine of many people in the region, because if they could so boldly attack American assets and American personnel in a military installation, then it's an indication that there's certain growth in Al-Shabaab. Could you more or less lay this one out for us and for the benefit of the viewers and people who do not have security background and who are also not that well informed on the American military operations and the way the military basically secures itself? Tell us why was that? Why was it so easy for Al-Shabaab to do what it did?
Well,
perform what it performed.
Well, this was a game-changing attack by Al-Shabaab. Yes. That had been planned for many months. Mm-hmm. It essentially revealed a not very secret U.S. government-Kenyan relationship at Manda Bay that has been that relationship has been there for 10, 12 years, at least. But the way it was launched was the first time that Al-Shabaab had attacked a Kenyan military facility within the borders of the country. Now, when we refer to how Americans secure their personnel, this is not a facility, Camp Simba that is, or the use of Manda Bay base. This is not a base in a war zone, notionally. And as a result, the host government was responsible for the security of that base. The reports are still very, very sketchy, in fact, as to whether the Kenyan security personnel fought anyone or just disappeared. The New York Times essentially had a very unfortunate headline that the Kenyan Defense Forces hid in the grass. I believe that's a headline to grab your attention. I do believe, however, that the security personnel were asleep at the wheel and they left as well, because it's very unusual to have an attack by somewhere between 30 and 50. This is the AFRICOM, the U.S. government, if you will, mm-hmm. estimate, somewhere between 30 and 50 Al-Shabaab fighters mm-hmm. attack a base. The details as to how they forced their way through the gate are also still shrouded in mystery. What is not as to whether there was a vehicle-borne IED with a suicide bomber who detonated himself at the gate. However, AFRICOM did say, very importantly, that the attack was triggered by indirect fire weapons, which are mortars, which means that Al-Shabaab was able to set up at least one mortar, if not two, somewhere between 2 and 3 kilometers away from the perimeter. The mortars can reach out, depending on the shell, but you have an effective range very often of anywhere between 9 and 10 kilometers. On the other hand, Al-Shabaab would have been just shooting at the fence line. The photographs from the scene also indicate that the surrounding area had not been cleared of foliage. In other words, you could get right up to the fence through the bushes without being seen. That gives you concealment. Another thing that, when we look at security, is, as you're aware, the Al-Shabaab managed to get onto the airstrip.
Yeah,
and one of the aircraft...
They came all the way inside there.
Yes, and one of the aircraft was taking off, was about to take off. Well, they fired a rocket-propelled grenade at the aircraft and caught it as it was taking off, and it blew up and caught fire. The two contractors U.S. citizen pilots working for a company, L3 Harris, which is not unusual, were both killed. The contractor who was in the aircraft, whose job was to man all the surveillance equipment on the plane during the flight, was severely burned. He escaped the plane and had to be evacuated and is now back in the States. A U.S. Army soldier, regular Army soldier, who was
also on the airstrip.
He was by the airstrip in a pickup truck. He was killed.
It was like the control tower.
Yes,
basically
right.
acting as a control tower.
Yes, that's true.
Clearing the plane to go out there on the surveillance.
That's correct.
So I mean, they got into the place. They didn't have to blow up anything. They were right inside.
Well, they might have had to blow up the gate, but it appears that since there was nobody manning the gates, it's questionable how difficult that was. I think it's also important.
And then they went out there and blew up how many other
6 or 7 aircraft. 6 or 7 aircraft were damaged, including
which means there was nobody fighting. There was no return fire in this case.
The return fire started 1 hour after the initial attack.
Okay.
And that was because at Camp Simba there were what are known as Marine Special Forces, Marine Corps Raiders,
yes.
12 of them, a squad, whose job it is to train the KDF, Rangers, the Somali Danab, and other special forces. They were there to train and assist. Keep in mind, these Marines were not there to defend Camp Simba or Manda Bay. They were there as trainers and instructors. Yeah. But they are superbly trained individuals anyway, and they are, after all, Marines. So it took them about an hour, which is not unusual, to draw their weapons, to develop the situational awareness of what's going on. It's not like the movies where you just rush off carrying a rifle without your boots on. And they led, quite frankly, their students. They were Kenya Defense Forces Rangers at Camp Simba being trained by the Marines who followed, and the Rangers did what they do. They followed the Marines into combat. And that allowed the Marines to clear the airstrip and start, what was interesting is how Al-Shabaab made no real attempt to go after the other 100 or so Americans who were sheltering in their tents. It could have been a huge catastrophe. But I would suggest that by knocking out the surveillance aircraft, plus there were 2 helicopters that are there as search and rescue helicopters. In other words, to recover pilots, American pilots.
They're also blown up?
Yes. Oh, yes. But they're not armed. The point, see, this was an intelligence gathering facility. This was not a forward combat base. For the Kenyans, however, it is a Navy base, an operational base that notionally has been defended since the early 90s.
Al-Shabaab has been very active in the Boni Forest and in the Lamu area for all these years. Now, clearly, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand that if they see there are certain lapses in the security, they would grab such an opportunity.
Well, I have little doubt that there are memos and files, either at the U.S. Embassy, up in Stuttgart, at the Pentagon, from people who have served at Manda Bay, have rotated through there, and have commented on all manner of security gaps and lapses. And this is not unusual. It doesn't make it right, however. When the barracks were blown up at Al-Anbar in Saudi Arabia in 1991, it was found that the security gates had already been delivered next to the road. But it had taken endless amounts of memos between the U.S. Air Force, it was an Air Force barracks, and the government in Riyadh, the Saudi government, to get it installed. This was also true when our embassies were blown up in Beirut, at least twice, by the way.
But now we keep telling the government, every time we have this menace, including the shifters, it's only Somalis who can, and people of pastoralist background. The Pokots, the Turkana, the Maasai, the Marakwets, the Tugen, the Samburus. These are the kind of people who basically are in a position, because you can't fight Al-Shabaab using mechanized trucks and tanks and the rest of it. This is an insurgency. They walk from place to place. So if you have to follow them, you follow them on foot.
Well, there have been
and why is it that? Because it has failed. I can assure you, it has completely failed. There is no way you can get somebody who was born in Kisumu or born in Nyeri and other places. Exceptional cases are always there, but by and large, they cannot handle that kind of a terrain in the manner that's supposed to be done. So they'll end up punishing the wrong people, which creates more ranks for the insurgency. So why are we not using what you call an intelligence, or rather an intelligent method of dealing with these things?
Well, I think you've raised many issues, and I don't agree with everything you said.
Okay.
Mainly because you can take a boy from New York City and he can be trained and function somewhere else.
The British tried with their boys from
that's
Kingston
true.
and everywhere, and it's
But
failed.
when we look at the frontier, the northern frontier
I'll
district.
give you some few links right now with an history that is very easily available.
Yes,
with Hampton Finch, who the boyfriend of Karen,
yes,
who used to do livestock and brought some cowboys to go and they were all wiped out in there.
Well, but I also know that.
Okay, proceed.
But if you talk about counterinsurgency operations,
Yes.
if you focus only on the security aspect of it, which is important, you see, what we're looking at now, and this links into why there was an attack at Manda Bay on January 5th, is that Al-Shabaab has detected the weakness of the Kenyan state. After 8 years of its war on Kenya, basically from October of 2011 onwards, Al-Shabaab, with its constant attacks in the 5 frontline counties in close proximity to Somalia, including kidnapping Cuban doctors from Mandara town, and they have now seen that the reactions of the Kenyan security forces is, to say the least, it's formulaic, it's desultory, it's counterproductive, as you've pointed out, by extorting the locals.
And going to the wrong people.
That's right. And also we have...
That way, fill in the ranks of Al-Shabaab, because when you kill somebody's grandmother, for the heck of it, 82-year-old grandmother who was buried. And
yes, I appreciate that. It does create a huge amount of resentment. Mm-hmm. We know for a fact that if you look at the Wagala massacre, where possibly at least 5,000 were killed at Wagala, you have 5,000 families still nursing grudges against the people in the same uniform.
Absolutely.
And the fact that nobody was ever punished, to the best of my knowledge, only one junior officer was sacked after Wagala. He ended up working with Bob Morgan Security as the building supervisor at Feta Towers. I met him there. Mm-hmm. and he was the only one. He was not the senior officer at the airstrip either. He was a very junior officer. Mm-hmm. And we have this history of covering up and not taking action.
Provincial commissioner at the time, who was called Benson Carrier, was there in this in the Truth and Reconciliation.
And we also know,
and he said he had no regrets about what he did. In other words, it's good game to kill every Somali and any Somali, because
there's a lot of people who don't
that
have
essentially is some kind of an appetite which is in the psyche. And if he still holds that today, then you can tell me about how united country we have today.
That's true, and when people say I have no regrets, that needs to be discussed.
Absolutely.
And
nothing was done to him because his
ethnic,
ethnic cousin is in the system that time and running the system itself.
True. But
so
let's keep in mind that sometimes after you have horrific systems coming to an end, or you have crimes against humanity committed, for example, under apartheid, that many of the members of the security force were basically, if they went before Desmond Tutu's commission, Truth and Justice Commission, they were given amnesty for their crimes. They confessed
but everything was...
And it was out in the open. That's
out
right.
In the open and never to be repeated, and some kind of a compensation also was done too.
But now we have a Truth, Justice, Reconciliation report
Nobody
here
wants to take out the report.
You can have access to it on the internet. But you're not quite sure if that's entirely accurate.
No.
We know that some segments
a lot of changes
were done.
Some of the commissioners quit.
The 3 foreigners left.
Yes.
They left after submitting their chapters.
Yes.
And they took off.
Yeah.
And so you now have the American Sly, I believe it is, just put out a book as well. I think it's important that because things are not discussed in this country, we don't really know exactly what happened, which is why we're running into a problem with this Manda Bay attack, because nobody wants to admit that the forces were not ready to repel the attack, but also how is it possible, if you have any sort of relations with the community in and around the Kenya Navy base, that nobody reported the fact that there were 30 to 50 fighters, that people were in fact making notes, that people who were making deliveries of supplies to the base, collecting rubbish, just the normal daily events that happen in and around a base, where you deliver food, you deliver bedding, you have tenders out in the local community for meat.
I want to believe most of the Al-Shabaab operatives in the Lamu area are actually Swahili boys from the coast, Bajuni, Swahili, and the rest of them from the coast.
Well,
And probably very little component of foreigners or Somalis in that case.
well, that's true. I think it is very true now.
It's easy for such information to be accessed.
Well, in fact, you know, if you ever see the coconut plantations at the coast, you see the coconut palms, there are steps cut into them.
Yes.
And those coconut palms grow right up to the
Base.
the Manda base, which means that every day somebody going up to harvest coconuts can watch planes taking off. And through the magic of iPhones, that almost everyone carries now, it's really very easy.
I just hope as a county insurgency they don't go and cut off all the trees now.
No.
And eliminate the livelihood of those people.
Well,
that essentially then creates a very big pool of people who don't have anything to live on, but would rather join the Al-Shabaab now because they're out of bitterness.
Well,
I mean, everything we do always is shooting ourselves in the feet.
Very often that's true. In fact, we know that the people arrested in the aftermath of the attack by the Kenyan security forces were just farmers.
Absolutely.
From the air. They were
they're
not
tortured most likely. And
I don't know about that.
why did the Americans also miss out on having all that surveillance? Here they are taking off with planes and literally are in a position to zoom, or rather to target a very small thing like this cup of tea from the other end, from 30,000 feet above the sea level, or 15,000 feet above the sea level. Why were they not able to do that elaborate, powerful security surveillance setting in that place so that this kind of thing never happens?
Well, we'd have to ask the U.S. government what their mandate was. You see, I think you've raised a very important point. Were the U.S. facilities there to support the Kenyans in the war against Al-Shabaab within this country, or was it focused entirely on Somalia? There have been reports of U.S. personnel. And now, in the aftermath of the attack, we've learned that there are 350 U.S. security personnel permanently in
Manda Bay.
Not in Kenya. That includes at Nanyuki, co-located with the British. In Manda, where there's 120 Americans, there were other U.S. personnel who were training.
And we're just lucky that Al-Shabaab did not focus on those ones who were sitting in the
tents.
tents.
Yes, I'm very surprised. They were hiding in the tents. So that it means that the tents are sandbagged.
Yes.
That's cold comfort. I think, however, the aircraft were out in the open. There was no overhead cover, no revetments there. It was a peacetime, sort of like Wilson Airport, or like the airport that services Lamu Island, which is on Manda Island, just across.
Yes.
Very picturesque. You know, you take a boat, you take a dhow, and the thing is, what's very much a matter of concern is that the travel advisories put out in the aftermath of the attack in Manda Bay, the U.S. one was was mainly focusing on the Middle East. The British High Commission, or the Foreign Colonial Office, put out its travel advisory, which did a favor to Kenya's tourist industry by not putting Lamu Island off limits. Although it did say in its color coding that you need to contact the authorities to see if you want to go there. And also it said no overland traffic. The British government essentially said, do not go by land to Lamu. Well, what does that do for, now we understand why the Chinese stopped the work on the port and laid off 2,000 workers.
And literally just pulled out.
Yes, because obviously all of the logistics that comes for the Chinese construction operations comes from Mombasa. It comes up the coast. You know, since they don't have a seaport, there's no way to offload boats. So it's a chicken and egg.
The land.
They were using it, and we know that buses have been attacked on that road. And also, when Al-Shabaab attacked Kubio on January 27th, 2017, roughly 400 or 500 of their fighters came up that road from the Kenyan side of the border and attacked Kubio from the direction of Kenya, whereas the other half, the other 500 fighters,
came from the other side.
Well, yes, but the point, see, and what's interesting is it's interesting and very unfortunate for the policemen involved, a police vehicle from a border post responded to the attack at Kubio and drove up into Somalia, and of course they ran into an ambush and were all killed. But I mean, it tells you how close that was to Kenya.
Yeah.
But also, more importantly, if you are in a base facing out Al-Shabaab, and people are coming from the Kenyan side, you would assume, perhaps, that they must be Kenyan security forces, not Al-Shabaab attacking from the direction of Kenya.
But not in our case. I mean, they are having this free reign of the area, and they're walking. By the way, they're not going around with Land Rovers or Land
well,
Cruisers
they actually
they
do use their technicals, but they don't use the technicals for attacks. They use civilian vehicles. They also use a lot of police Land Cruisers that they've taken. We don't seem to ask.
From the Kenyan police.
Oh yeah, when they overrun Kenyan police camps, which are all along the border.
Yes.
At every attack, when you read the newspaper articles, the reports of this, essentially, the police left.
Took off.
They left the scene and waited for the attack to be over. And you know, I can tell you
You're being very kind with your words, my friend. They took off. They chickened out.
They don't have enough. This is a horrible situation that we're in. We do not deploy sufficient numbers of police. We have never acquired the air tractors that were ordered in 2016.
So what's the purpose of having a security post out there if you don't have sufficient men who have the capacity, and women who have the capacity?
It's pointless.
To at least defend themselves.
It has become pointless. You're right. What we're seeing this now in Sector 2.
The air tractors, these were basically what we bought from...
We were ordering them from the United States,
but
and John Githango was in the States, and he met with the congressman, a right-wing conservative, right-wing Republican congressman.
Because of corruption.
Because there was an extra $140 million added to the contract.
There you go.
And it was canceled, notionally it was canceled, rumor has it, at State House. It was in fact a rather... huge outburst of anger at State House about why is anyone adding an extra $140 million?
State of Nairobi?
Yes.
And they didn't know. The president and his team did not know about it.
Apparently.
So you have a military that essentially is in the procurement and all the rest of it is just as corrupt as the civilians are.
Well, yes, it seems that way.
Probably much more corrupt. I can assure you
because in
that,
fact, the security procurement is kept confidential. It's a secret.
That's the point. That's the whole idea.
Although the High Court did say the Auditor General can audit security procurement in this country, it's never really taken off. In fact, unfortunately, my discussions with the Auditor General in June of 2018, in the Auditor General's office with Eddie Ouko, about training, getting the Auditor General staff, a cadre, trained to understand that when you are auditing security forces procurement, you don't just count the number of airplanes or helicopters. Because the Constitution also says that the Auditor General, as an independent office, is supposed to make a decision and a judgment as to the effectiveness of the procurement. If you buy the wrong aircraft, and your people, the Auditor General's people, are unable to say that these aircraft are not suitable.
We buy second-hand from Jordan and where else?
Second-hand is not always bad. Old is sometimes gold. The thing is, though...
I stopped you when you were talking about the procurement in the armed forces, and the security sector, and the role the Auditor General is supposed to play.
Yes.
I will tell you, I had a relative, and I don't want to, I'm not at liberty to mention the name, who was in the security and was basically in procurement in the 90s, in the early 90s. And he told me of a situation in which an item that could be easily bought for 500 British pounds was sold to us for 120,000 British pounds at that time. And he was there. And this is because the military procurement and purchases itself are not subject to any audit. Then it was the ultimate, it was the mother of all corruption in the country itself. And then, of course, we had all that powerful, big allocations for the military. There are two security votes that are never audited. That is the one, and the other one is intelligence. Mm-hmm. Intelligence, understandable. I mean, that goes all over the world. Intelligence gathering has to be done hush-hush always. So I have no problem with that. Of course, we know that the bulk of that intelligence money is also used for elections. That's when people in power at that time use it without necessarily having to use their own money. But military, our own security, and we cannot check on whether we have value for money. And these are sometimes transport planes, some things that basically do not indicate, do not give us any problems on I mean, the confidentiality itself is not something that has that powerful meaning of justification for that confidentiality? Tell me. Or else you can have security, people with security passes, and to do that kind of an audit.
If you look at what the Auditor General's mission is, as per the Constitution, it's essentially to count all the assets, to make sure everything's been purchased, but also, it's a normal accountancy function, auditing function. But it also looks at the effectiveness. That is, if you buy aircraft, what are they for? Now, you see, when you talk about NIS, their vote, do we know how much NIS pays for a pen?
No.
And yet but that's not intelligence, is it?
No.
And yet we know that anybody in a system in any country who is not going to be audited about whether he's buying pens from his relative and paying 10 times or more the value,
times.
Whatever it is, we know everybody does it if they're not worried about getting caught.
Absolutely.
And this is true with human beings everywhere in the world. And I don't care how patriotic you think you are, this is normal. This is normal crime that goes on everywhere. The problem that we don't seem to have is normal punishment. We don't seem to be able to go after people. And this is why we've nurtured an environment of impunity. But now we have a situation where Al-Shabaab has essentially decided in 2020 to begin liberating areas of northeast Kenya. They're actually taking a page out of the Boko Haram book, where you drive the security forces away.
Or the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Or the Al-Shabaab in Somalia, who we know are administering 800,000 to 1 million Somali citizens, or civilians rather.
And collecting taxes.
And collecting taxes and collecting money.
Do you know that
from
they've already started doing that to the livestock owners inside the country?
Well, I would
in
imagine
Kenya
so,
itself also,
because we have a huge livestock rustling problem in this country.
BBI.
Ah, yes. Yeah. The BBI in the last week or two, as you're better informed than I, has come into this notion of regional collections of counties. That was also raised. We do have the economic bodies in Western Kenya now, the Lake Victoria group, Basin, Lake Basin, whatever it's called. But if you remember back to when
the northern also,
true, except but if you remember the
Simbagbled and the rest of them,
right? The Frontier County Development Council is a different story.
Yeah.
But that's not but it's more, what is coming across is more of a common services body to deliver the devolved services across county lines. I think
more of sharing experiences and putting resources together so that you can have the economies of scale. That's the feeling I get it. Politically, it would be good, in my opinion, to rationalize, because having 47 devolved units in a country of 47 million people or 46 million people is a sick thing.
Well, like it or not, of course.
The whole of America, which is 400 million people, has only 50 devolved units.
Like it or not, it is in the Constitution. Yeah. But more importantly, I think, what we've seen in places like Nigeria and now South Sudan is the multiplication of counties, or the multiplication of states as a means of answering, of possibly
a political
hiding.
Kind of a thing,
yes. And also notionally dealing with aspirations of smaller groups and people like that. I can't speak about whether that's effective or not. I know that it doesn't lead only to peace in Nigeria, certainly not. But here we have a situation where if you look at places like the coast,
it's all political in the case of
the coast
South Sudan.
was talking about secession. On November 1st, 2017, Governors Joho, and Kingi, and Senator Stuart Madzeo from Kilifi had a press conference where they announced coast secession. And we do know historically that the coastal area, which they included the hinterlands, of course, not just the 10-mile strip along the coast, which was a protectorate, didn't really have a full vote, if you will, in joining Kenya. It was an arrangement, because the new colony, or the new independent Kenya, did need a coastline. Okay, but when they had that press conference, they were actually discussing self-determination of the coastal region. At the same time, you may remember Honorable Kaluma introduced a bill, secession for Western Kenya, or whatever. The secessionist impulses can only, in fact, be encouraged by these regional blocs. particularly of areas where they believe,
I think,
and that's northeast Kenya too.
I think more than anything else, what basically informed those kind of, I wouldn't call them desperate, but extreme measures on the part of the western people, Kenya and the Coast Province and every other region, was the notion that was put into executive practice of the sharing of the country 50-50 between Kalenjins and Kikuyus.
Yes.
And basically it's like, you know, you have it for the Kalenjin and then you have it for the Kikuyu. And if we're going to be eternally not slaves, but basically subjects for these two communities, we might as well secede.
Well, these
so in other words, it was, look, there is no fairness in this union. Because there's no fairness in this union, and the resources are being shared 50-50 between these two, the rest of it is just symbolic for the rest of the country, so we might as well talk
And
about
at the
secession.
time, these were ODM politicians who had just, who had
but
just
I
seen the
don't
election
think, but
taken
I don't
away.
think it deep down in the minds of any of the Kenyan communities seriously considered that. Of course, that can only come out of a protracted, maintained alienation from the center. And that, my fear that would be not for the other parts of Kenya, but even in the case of the North had those notions at some stage that we'll never have fairness in here. We'll just be subjects or slaves for these people.
Well, I think we've agreed, however, that in northeast Kenya there has been an alienation of people historically, and now Al-Shabaab is reducing the influence of the national government.
No, let me just explain. Al-Shabaab is hated by them, so they hate Al-Shabaab more than anybody else. With all the imperfections of the center here, and the fact that the center is not taking adequately care of the people in the north, but still, because of the sessional paper number 10 of 1965, which basically talked about intensification of government resources in the high potential areas, as opposed to extensification, which left us out completely.
Yes, because those high potential areas were the ones
the
the
high
colonials,
potential areas, yes. So basically, even with that, like all people who live in extremely harsh conditions, you tend to become much more aggressive and much more productive. The Somali society, by and large, has integrated seamlessly and powerfully into the mainstream of the society, whether it is in economy or in the government or in business. And so the last thing a Somali thinks about today is what's called secession. That's not there. Of course, there is need to do better. There is need for the government, because so far we've been doing things on our own. So far we've been doing things on our own. And when they talk about Somalis taking over Kenya, which is a common, what do you call, a statement that's bandied around, it's because every time there's a drought, there are 200,000 Somalis who get displaced in those areas. And the only place they can come to is the high potential areas, because he said all the resources will be in the high potential, so they come to the places where the resources are. You get my point?
Yes.
So those are the kind of things. The way to try and stave off that kind of constant migration into the centers here is to create a lot of opportunities in the periphery.
Right.
And to begin with, let's start with security.
Yes.
Let's start with infrastructure. These are the kind of things they're looking for. But by and large, no Somali. A Somali would be the last person to want to secede from this country.
But see, when you mentioned infrastructure,
for the very simple reason, okay, at some stage, we've had 130 years of history as part of Kenya. And this is you throw me right now into Somalia, and there's very little I'm going to understand about it.
That's true.
And that basically is the situation we have now.
Now, you mentioned infrastructure.
It's like an American Jew like you. And if you had a choice to go and settle in Israel for good, you would have to give it a second thought about it. At
least 2 or 3
I grew
times.
up in Brooklyn.
Yes, in Queens. No, but you see, when you talk about infrastructure, we know now the President Kenyatta is in Washington, as is the Prime Minister, Raila Odinga, head of infrastructure for the AU. And there is talk now of a free trade agreement to be negotiated over the next 4 or 5 years
between the two
Kenya.
countries.
Yes, but when you look at the Kenyan government desire to establish yet another superhighway between Mombasa and Nairobi, and Bechtel was supposed to, the U.S. construction giant, was supposed to get that contract. I believe that Ambassador McCarter put a stop to it because of the incredible padding, the extra money that was in that whole deal, even though it was a U.S. company.
Corruption.
But that kind of $3 billion project, if Bechtel were given the assignment to construct all-weather roads, put up a Somalia border control mechanism to rehabilitate all of the airstrips, because they have done this, for better or worse, in Iraq, in Afghanistan and elsewhere. They have an entire, their
Put
portfolio
up
would
on
allow
all-weather
them.
road from Garissa to Mandera,
And
another
it
one
also-
to
and then-
Liboy across the border.
Exactly, and
down
also
there.
up through Lamu, all the way to the
It'll
Somalia
be
border.
history. It will be history.
The fact is,
Al-Shabaab will be history.
yes, and it also allows the security forces to patrol adequately, more effectively.
Absolutely,
It
absolutely.
allows teachers to come and go.
Rapid deployment. You
Yes.
just rush them there on
And
the
all
tarmac
the-
road. You cannot put AEDs on the tarmac.
Yeah.
You drop them there, and there they go and chase them by foot.
And the fact is that Bechtel would have no difficulty putting fences along the border and everything else, and doing the airstrips, the
fence
all-weather
is-
road.
is
Well, I'm a big fan of
expensive.
watchtowers, which brings me to the notion of one of the things since we started talking about the Lamu attack. Do you know we don't even know if there were watchtowers at Manda Bay?
I'm surprised.
And yet we know there are watchtowers at the Army camp across from ABC Place on Wayaki Way. There's a watchtower.
Anytime you have an army base somewhere, there
And
must
it
be a
is
watch-
covered with
I have no
camouflage
doubt in my
netting.
mind there must be watchtowers.
And there are at least 2 or 3 of them, and in Hurlingham, at the Army, the Ministry of Defense
and
headquarters.
big, massive lights that you basically.
Well, they
just
don't
keep on
actually. I've
beaming
never
all
seen
over.
lights up there. I've seen them. You know, they've got the
Well,
watchtowers.
this is an urban setting, but of course,
But
in
it's
the rural
interesting
areas,
that we
there has
have.
to be lights.
There
yes.
should be, but you shoot those out. But we have watchtowers in an urban setting in Hurlingham that are covered with camouflage netting to make them look like bushes. But we don't know
If we had,
if
that
we
in
had
Manda,
watchtowers, and I'm
I,
convinced
I'm sure
that
they
some.
have. I'm sure they have them. Those are very basic, rudimentary security arrangements that I doubt they would.
Well, then the question is,
have
were
an
they
oversight of
were they
that.
manned at the night of at the morning of the attack? Was anybody in the watchtower?
People were sleeping on the job. There's no doubt. About
Yes,
that.
that's true. And
Yes,
so
yes,
we, so we end up with a situation where 1 month after the attack, there are still more questions than answers. And the questions go to a lot of people's careers, including Americans. It goes to what the heck were they doing there? Was the surveillance, the intelligence gathering and surveillance, was that shared regularly with the Kenyans? And if not, why not? Because we do know that NIS has shared information with the police who have failed to react. So we shouldn't really have this much controversy over the basic facts of what took place from 5:30 a.m. on January 5th.
To what time?
It took about I think it took 5 or 6 hours, 7 hours to adequately clear the entire camp.
And did they parade any Al-Shabaab bodies?
They showed pictures of 6 or 8 dead people in camouflage, but we've never seen the photographs up close. We don't know. We also, I'm sure, however, I believe that with the reaction force that came in from Djibouti, that the scene was secured because there's a lot of classified material in those aircraft and on the base. And that's all been spirited away. We don't know if anything's been replaced because those airplanes have to be ordered. And yes, it's a bureaucracy. American procurement can be very slow.
Yeah.
Thing is, though, we still have nobody talking about the role of the KDF in defending a KDF base within the borders of Kenya.
One thing, if we do have tweaking a little bit of the devolution arrangement in the country and are looking at some kind of a superstructures instead of 47 counties, different devolved units, we have 14, 15, 16. And then, of course, we collapse some of these counties together into one unit with one head, and maybe have the sub whatever counties, which is in whatever we're going to call them. Would you favor that kind of an arrangement to benefit the economics of scale, the economics of scale in this case?
Well, you see, it's a simple question to answer because it's in the Constitution. So we have to amend the Constitution to reduce the number. And now we're introducing.
We'll have to go for a referendum, of course. Yes.
Yes, and we had the last referendum we had, of course, was 4th August 2010. So the talk about referenda now in June or July means that we will have a lost decade. We will have another referendum.
Well, basically, we will have a decade in which we learn so much from a very good constitution, and that you have amended your constitution 38, 39 times or 37
Actually,
times.
We've amended it
37 times, I think.
You know,
we
over 250
we are
years.
now in 60 years into, or 60 years into our own independence. So amending it a second time or a third time is not such a big deal.
It's, in this case,
let
seems to be more of a Pandora's box.
ask you one more pointed
Sure.
question. Having seen your friend and your president, Donald
Yes.
Trump, and how the presidency has divided, we're not the only ones who are divided, how the presidency has divided American people and nation, 400 million people, right across the middle. And would you still, looking at the British system and looking at all others, the Chancellor of Germany and a number of other prime ministers, and how in Europe, except in the case of France, many of them also use the parliamentary system and they have a prime minister as the head of the government. Would you favor, and the kind of conflicts we go through every time we have a presidential election in the country, because it's an imperial presidency, just like Trump is what we have here. Would you favor a parliamentary system in Kenya and maybe by extension even your own America?
Well, you know, I've lived here for more
For
than half
30 odd years,
for
yes.
38 years.
Yes, yes.
So I'm no longer
An American as much as, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, what's happened in the last 3 years with Trump is a phenomenon that's most unfortunate from my point of view. It represents a divisiveness in America that we haven't really seen enunciated.
And he's likely to win the elections, I'm told.
It's very likely because they're focusing again on the Electoral College. The Electoral College was designed to prevent the imperial president. They were designed. It was designed to allow smaller states to speak out. Now we're in a situation where half the population in America, voters, and Americans don't vote, by the way. Less than 60% of all eligible voters are registered to vote, and we have elections where, you know,
and out of that 60%, probably
maybe
another
half,
60% is the one who
60% will come out to vote.
just votes.
Yes, and so you
you're
and if
looking
you
at an
shave it-
overall 30, less than 50%
Yes.
of Americans vote.
Very-
Eligible voters.
That's true, and you know, but we have very powerful governors. We have very powerful mayors. We have a lot of devolved functions that where Americans don't see themselves in Washington as such a big deal. But Donald Trump's base is in what they call the flyover states. But if you assemble enough of these states that have 5 electoral votes, and you grab a couple of big states, Michigan or Pennsylvania, Florida, you end up with the 270 votes you need in the Electoral
California.
College to win. Well, California is never going to go for Trump. But what this means is that whoever gets the Democratic nomination is going to have to waste a lot of time and money in all these little states. Because it's not about getting out the vote in California, because the Democrats can count on California, pretty much count on New York as far as the electoral votes. It's how much time can you spend campaigning again in the general election in Kansas, in Iowa,
Wyoming, Montana.
North Dakota, South Dakota. You know, this is a very serious,
Electoral colleges are small.
and that's why the funding of our elections, which is still basically private and corporate,
Iowa.
means that the more
Maine.
money you have, you can spend for opening offices to get out the vote in those states. You see, the last time there was a genuinely contested electoral college vote was in 2000 when Bush ran against Gore, because in many of the states, in New Mexico, the popular vote was so close that the electoral votes could have gone either way if 5,000 votes were changed. And this also unfortunately means, and this is a bad lesson for Kenya and everybody else to learn.
Winner take all.
Not just winner take all, but voter suppression in the United States. Suppressing members of minority groups.
If you get 50.6% in a what you call the majoritarian rule, where it's a system of elections,
Yes.
50 plus 50.05% in California, then you get the whole electoral college for that. Why not get just 50 plus point something percent of the electoral college?
Well, there is one state now where they divide up the electoral votes.
That's the point.
Because the states are allowed to do that.
Yes.
But you see, this is a long, drawn-out process of even doing that. And you see, if you have a state where you have a Republican-controlled legislature, they're not going to vote to do that. We have seen a situation now growing in the United States 50 years after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where things are being done in any number of states to prevent African American, Latino voters from actually
voting.
being able to vote. And as a lifelong Republican,
Emancipation.
well, as a lifelong Republican, I find it appalling what's happened, although I have to say mea culpa. Republicans always used to hope for rain on Election Day because Republicans have cars and people of color did not have
I'm
cars.
surprised, one thing, you're an American Jew.
Right.
The Jews are almost split right in the middle. Half of them are Democrats, the other half are
Actually, it's more like
Republicans.
70%, 75% are Democrats.
And 25% are Republicans.
And that's always been although I don't think I'm a Republican much anymore.
And you managed to have that very powerful divide because the Latinos, they will say the Latinos will vote in this. The African Americans are likely to vote here. I've never seen somebody say the Jews are likely to vote in this direction or not.
That's always been a controversy in America because most groups, like the Japanese,
Yes.
People from South Asia,
Yeah.
as you go up in your economic
They go
life,
Republican.
you become Republican.
Yes.
Not Jewish people. And a lot of that does go to the notion of human rights,
I know.
the Talmud
I know.
and Bible.
American Jews are by and large the custodians of the global human rights crusade.
But also, if you look at, I was having a discussion last night in a
crusade
social
is
place.
probably the wrong word to use, but the
Yes.
movement. I mean, crusade,
Most of the
crusade has that
ANC
very, very, what do you call, the difficult notion
Well, I had an
for
interesting,
Muslims and Jews
I had
also.
an interesting discussion last night in a social
Muslims and
place
Jews also,
about
because,
a
yeah,
white
but-
South African of Portuguese origin.
Yes.
And I mentioned something about how when I was applying for immigration many years ago, and the immigration service in South Africa obviously said, oh, we don't want another Jew or English speaker as well, Afrikaans. But he made a point, which is that many of the ANC lawyers and
Jews.
agitators
Were
were
Jews.
Jews,
Yes,
Jewish South
yes,
Africans.
yes,
And if you look at people like Albie Sachs,
Yes, I know.
who, yes, so do I.
Albie Sachs,
He lost
Slovo.
Joe
was a Jew.
Slovo was head of the
Was a Jew, yes.
of the
Was a
Spear of the
East
Nation,
European Jew, yeah.
and,
The lady, what was her name?
and Ruth First, who
Yes,
was thrown out of here in 1965 for
Yes.
supporting the Land and Freedom Army,
Yes, yes,
and then was
yes.
blown up in Angola when she received the package from the
She
South
was killed
African.
there, yes, I
yes,
know.
but you know,
A
but
hero in every sense of the word.
very
No.
much so.
I mean, this.
But this was point. So this it's not something. It is not something that is unique to America. It seems. I mean, one of
It's the
Mugabe's
overall Jewish global. It's sad that in Palestine the situation.
It's
is completely
it's
different.
unbelievable what's
It's
now
unbelievable,
happening
what's happening
with
right
Israel,
now, which is-
and now we have a Trump
yes.
type president
Yes.
or prime minister
Yes,
with
yes,
Netanyahu,
yes. Yeah, I know.
or Trump is more like Netanyahu.
It's disgusting. It's disgusting.
It is.
And many Jews are pissed off with that. and
Yes,
to the
except
core.
that in Israel you have this. It's like it becomes an existential problem
yes,
because you don't want to be standing in the Mediterranean up to your chest in the water. But this latest peace deal, by the way, between the United States and with the United States and Israel, leaving out the Palestinians, after the Dusit attack, the Al-Shabaab referenced an Al-Qaeda talking point about stopping the Judaization of Jerusalem as a reason. Now, and also that was referenced again after the attack at Manda Bay. So in fact, because the United States has just suddenly abandoned 60 years of a two-state or any sort of honest broker, whether we are or not is a different story, or have been, it is going to be open season on Americans. And Al-Qaeda takes the view, and Al-Shabaab is an Al-Qaeda affiliate or franchise, that no matter where an American is or who that American is, we are all targets. And that should lead to some questions about our safety, security of anybody who is here in Nairobi or elsewhere. Not just because there are Americans all over the place, that's not true. But in fact, there are targets that we know of.
Well, it's difficult to understand where these things come from because, to the best of my knowledge, I don't know why a Somali, Al-Shabaab Somalis, should be that overly worried about what goes on in Jerusalem when his own country is in the kind of a shithole it is.
Well, you're right, Farah, but I only know what I read when I read the
Al-Shabaab
literature.
What I don't understand is that who runs Al-Shabaab?
And then that's a whole...
The Emirates, the Saudis, and by extension, I don't think the Western intelligence is very far from that. So it's a bit tricky. You never know what's happening, my friend. This world is full of the most impossible thing that you can imagine, but it turns out to be. So well, I have I have personally, I don't understand who's doing these things. And
Well, it makes very little difference if it's Saudi money financing an Al-Shabaab attack on the Dusit Hotel, or if it's American or some intelligence service, if you're caught up in it. And so the only thing I could say is the best we can do is be protected ourselves.
Look,
but also,
15 of the 19 folks who went in there were Saudis.
I know.
And nobody mentioned anything about the Saudis. Osama bin Laden is from the bin Laden family.
Yes.
At the time when this was happening, then a big section of the bin Laden family were being hosted in the White House.
And construction.
And yes, and are very close friends of George Bush.
And the last terrorist attack we had at a U.S. training base, the last terrorist shooting we had in Pensacola was a Saudi officer.
Yes, yes.
Who was in training.
Absolutely. And then look at, nobody talks about Saudis being terrorists, for your information.
Some of us do.
And then you look at the American ship was sunk by the British to draw the Americans into the...
Oh, that's the Lusitania. But I mean, you know, we know about
Lusitania.
Lusitania, which all the civilian life. It was an ocean liner.
Absolutely, but that was not done entirely by the British alone. The Americans had a role also in that. They wanted to get into the war. They had to get a justification to convince the American public that we have to go into this war and maybe eliminate the divide, because it was a very powerful divide. Remember that Joseph Kennedy was not for the Americans going into that war.
Right, because he was anti-British.
He was anti-British, of course.
Being Irish.
But the only way to unite the American opinion on that was basically what happened. Look at what the Germans are doing to us, and America went into the war. So everything that is happening here in the world is...
Well, you make us sound like we're all helpless.
Illuminati.
So, yeah, well, you make us sound like we're helpless, waiting to be victims here.
I don't know, frankly.
And I would suggest that the only thing we can do is
let's do whatever little we can do ourselves.
Which is what I try to do.
Yeah, that's what
and we have to keep our own...
If we worry about everything else, we'll end up doing nothing. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Andrew Franklin. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
You are a brilliant lawyer, security analyst, and intellectual in his own right. And I always find a lot of pleasure in either sharing a cup of tea with you and talking over issues, or hosting you is even for me. That's why I host you more often than most other.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Guests in
Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
And I hope we can, our interviews, which basically are not an interview, this is an interactive debate between me and you, and I hope that changes a lot for our country, and for us to be able to take some informed decisions where we can educate the masses as much as possible on things that are ordinarily seen to be too obvious, but are not obvious. Thank you very much again.
You're very welcome.
Viewers, we have come to the end of our show today, and have a good night until we get together again next week.